Napoleon, master of Europe, then a prisoner left to rot on a rock. In 1821, on a tiny island lost in the ocean, he died slowly in terrible agony, and the true cause stayed a dark mystery. And it all started here, in cannon smoke and blood and chaos, where one unknown young officer turned a hopeless battle into victory. And it all began in the chaos of war. Cannon fire, smoke and screams, the only world this man would ever truly master. He was born here, on the wild rocky island of Corsica, a poor outsider, far away from the glittering wealth and power of mainland France. At the military school, the rich French boys mocked his strange accent and his foreign name, so he fought back completely alone, burning with cold, silent fury. Then his father suddenly died, and everything collapsed. At just 16, the boy became the man his whole struggling poor family now desperately depended on. So he buried himself in books night after night, devouring history, war and tactics, already planning battles that no one else around him could even imagine. He rose fast as a young artillery officer, sharp and ruthless, commanding the heavy guns with a cold brilliance that older men simply could not match. Then all of France suddenly exploded into bloody revolution. The old world was burning down, and his impossible chance had finally arrived. The young captain saw what all the experienced generals around him could not: drag the heavy cannons up onto the high ground, and the impossible fortress would finally fall. He aimed the guns himself and fired them himself, and at just 24 years old, he shattered the enemy fleet and woke up a national hero overnight. The whole harbor burned, and the enemy fleet fled in panic, and France suddenly realized this strange little foreign outsider was a weapon unlike anything they had ever seen. Back in Paris, when a furious armed mob came surging to seize power by force, he calmly met them with cannons and crushed the entire revolt in just a few brutal minutes. They handed him a general's coat, and he took it cold and ready, already hungry for something far greater than rank. He wanted real, total power. Then he met her, older, dangerous, and irresistible. And this ruthless soldier fell so hard and so fast that he could barely think straight around her. But love would have to wait. He leapt onto his horse and rode off to conquer all of Italy and history itself. In Italy, he moved faster than anyone thought possible, smashing one army after another, and his starving soldiers began to worship him like a god of war. When a bridge became a deadly trap under heavy fire, he seized a flag and charged straight into the bullets, and his men followed without hesitation. Then he dragged his army across a burning desert toward the pyramids, chasing the same glory as the ancient conquerors he had worshipped since boyhood. Beneath those silent pyramids, he unleashed his cannons, and the proud Mamluk horsemen were torn apart against his squares in dust, smoke, and blood. But the British burned his fleet to ashes, and suddenly the conqueror was trapped, stranded in the desert with no way home for his dying army. Then plague swept through his ranks, and to crush their terror, he walked straight into the infected hospital and touched the sick with his bare hands. And then he did the unthinkable. He secretly abandoned his trapped army in the night and slipped away by ship, saving only himself. Yet back in Paris, no one knew the truth, and the crowds roared his name, hailing the deserter as the savior of France. Hungry for absolute power, he stormed the council with armed soldiers, and the terrified politicians screamed for his arrest as they clawed at his coat. But his grenadiers charged in with bayonets and cleared the hall in seconds, and just like that, the Republic was dead and he ruled France. At his coronation, he refused to kneel before the Pope. Instead, he lifted the crown with his own hands and placed it on his own head. No man would crown him. He had taken everything himself. Then he turned and crowned his beloved wife Empress before all of Europe. Now an emperor, he built a war machine of devoted soldiers who would die for him, ready to march across the entire continent at his command. And by candlelight, he reshaped France itself. New laws, new courts, a code so powerful it still survives in the world today.
Right.
Across Europe, kings trembled at his name, and they began to plot together to destroy him before he destroyed them all. In 1805, on a freezing December dawn, three great empires clashed in battle, and the young emperor finally sprang his deadly, carefully planned trap at Austerlitz. He smashed his army straight through their weak, exposed center, splitting the enemy clean in two as massed cannons tore the frozen field apart. The shattered, panicking enemy fled out onto a frozen lake, and his heavy cannons cracked the ice beneath them, swallowing whole regiments into the freezing black water. By nightfall in 1805, it stood as his greatest victory ever, and at just 36 years old, he had become the absolute master of all Europe. By 1807, his empire stretched across the whole continent, and cheering crowds hailed him as the greatest conqueror since the days of ancient Rome. Alone in his palace, he redrew the borders of Europe like a game, placing his own brothers on the thrones of conquered kingdoms. Yet at the very peak of his power, a cold fear crept in. Deep down, he sensed that holding all of this would destroy him. In 1812, he gathered the largest army the world had ever seen, over 600,000 men, and marched east to crush Russia forever. But the Russians refused to fight him. They retreated and burned everything behind them, leaving him only ashes, empty fields, and silence. At last, the Russians turned and fought him at Borodino, the single bloodiest day of the entire war, leaving tens of thousands of men dead in just a few short hours. He won the field, yet it was a hollow and meaningless victory. The battered Russian army simply pulled back once again and vanished into their vast, endless land. In September 1812, he finally marched into Moscow, expecting total surrender, but found the great city silent, abandoned, and utterly empty. That same night, the city exploded into flames. The Russians had burned their own sacred capital rather than hand it to him. He waited in the smoking ruins for a peace that never came, while the deadly Russian winter slowly closed its jaws around his trapped army. With no food and no shelter left, the emperor was finally forced to give the one order no conqueror ever wants to give: retreat. Then, the real killer struck. A brutal cold of -30 degrees, and his mighty army began to freeze and starve to death by the thousands. At the icy rivers, they died in panicked crowds, and the proudest army in history dissolved into a frozen, broken mob of ghosts. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia in 1812, barely a few thousand frozen survivors limped back out alive, and the emperor had already abandoned them, racing ahead to Paris alone to save his crumbling throne before the terrible news arrived. By the year 1814, almost all of Europe turned on him at once. His exhausted, beaten armies were driven back step by step, and enemy soldiers finally poured onto French soil itself. Then his own most loyal marshals, the very men who had fought for years to build his empire, coldly turned their backs on him and flatly refused to fight for him any longer. In 1814, the once unstoppable conqueror finally surrendered, forced to give up his throne and everything he had spent his whole life fighting to build. They exiled him to a tiny island, a fallen emperor staring out at the sea, stripped of the vast empire that had once made the whole world tremble. But in 1815, he escaped, and when the soldiers sent to capture him saw his face, they threw down their weapons and roared his name instead. Within days, he ruled France again, and a furious Europe gathered one last enormous army to crush Napoleon Bonaparte forever at Waterloo. For one brutal day, his soldiers hurled themselves at the enemy again and again, but the lines would not break, and slowly his last great army was destroyed. By nightfall, the battle was lost. His men fled in panic, his empire shattered, and the greatest conqueror of the entire age stood completely defeated. This time, there would be no second return. They shipped him to a tiny rock lost in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles away from anywhere. The man who had ruled almost all of Europe was now just a lonely prisoner on a cold, wind-beaten island at the very edge of the known world. There, he slowly wasted away, sick, angry, and bitter, haunted every day by the glory he had lost as the empty grey sea swallowed his final years. And in 1821 he died in terrible agony. And even now, many people still believe he was quietly poisoned with arsenic on that lonely little island. The man who had crowned himself the master of all Europe died alone in a damp little room, with no army, no empire, and no crown left to his name. He was gone. But the laws that he wrote, the borders he redrew, and the dark legend he left behind would go on haunting the whole world for centuries. From a poor island boy to the emperor of Europe, and back to a grave on a distant rock, that was the brutal rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more legendary stories from history's darkest and greatest figures.